On day 5 of the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard defamation trial, we finished up the testimony of Sean Bett, Johnny Depp's security guard, and then we met Johnny's sound technician, Keenan Wyatt, and then we heard from Johnny Depp himself. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, welcome to Legalbytes. If you are new here, my name is Alita. I'm a lawyer licensed in California and DC, and on this channel, we explain the law one bite at a time. So when we left off yesterday, Sean Bett finished his direct examination, and we recessed before he started his cross-examination by Amber Heard's legal team. As a reminder, he talked about some of Johnny's injuries that he had seen, and he said that he had never seen Johnny actually get violent against Amber. He also said that he never saw Amber get violent against Johnny other than throwing a water bottle or a plastic cup of some sort. Now, in today's trial live stream, Ben Rottenborn did the cross-examination of Mr. Bett, and I have to say that this was the cleanest and most effective cross-examination by the Heard legal team that we have yet seen. Unlike his cross-examination of Christy Dombrowski, Mr. Rottenborn didn't come right off the bat as overly aggressive, but he was very precise and direct. His questions followed this kind of a pattern. He would say, "You're Johnny's full-time employee, correct?" "Correct." "You've worked for him for 15 years, correct?" "Correct." "You weren't there in Australia, correct?" "Correct." "You weren't on the Boston to LA flight, correct?" "Correct." "Same with the Bahamas?" "Correct." "Same with the flight to Tokyo?" "Correct." These kinds of questions were tight and prevented Mr. Bett from inserting his own narrative in order to answer the question. And they also got him into Rottenborn's chosen rhythm of answering yes or no to him. Now, at the same time, Ms. Vasquez on the Depp legal team also did a better job today in her part of this trial, where she timely objected to certain objections throughout the cross-examination. Yesterday, she had gotten a bit tripped up in the way that she framed some of her questions on direct exam, and so she drew a lot of objections from the other side that seemed to throw her off. So today, it looked like she had really brushed it all off and did a good job here. Now, one of the main things to take away from Mr. Bett's cross-examination is that he's kind of an example of what happens when a witness tries to oversell his or her testimony. Now, anytime a witness agrees to testify on behalf of a party, generally speaking, they'll have some kind of bias. They're usually going to be friendly or unfriendly to some side. And it's fine for juries to see this kind of bias and to see where this bias comes from so that they can evaluate it and see if it's impacting the substance of the witness's testimony. Now, yesterday I mentioned how it seemed like Mr. Betts was trying a little bit too hard to squeeze in testimony where he really wasn't supposed to. This is the kind of thing that, if done too much, the jury may start to notice and discount the testimony as a result. Now, another way that a witness can run into trouble with overselling testimony is that they can make themselves subject to impeachment. If you don't know, impeachment is basically where a witness has previously testified elsewhere, usually in some kind of a deposition, to one thing. And then at trial, when they are testifying in front of a jury, they testify in a different way. Typically, that different way is going to be friendly to one side or the other. And when the witness testifies inconsistently like that, the opposing attorney can use the witness's prior testimony in court to point out to the jury that the witness is not being consistent. And this in turn means that the jury might find that the witness is less credible or less honest, and that can impact how much weight the jury ends up giving to this witness's testimony. Now, in this cross-examination, Mr. Bett was impeached on several occasions. For example, in court today, he testified that on May 21st, 2016, Amber was wearing very little makeup. But then on cross-examination, Mr. Rottenborn took out Mr. Bett's deposition, where Mr. Bett said that he actually couldn't remember if she was wearing any makeup. This might seem like a ticky-tacky small difference, but to an objective observer, this can really start to look like Mr. Bett was trying to tweak things or bend things in small ways so that he was making things look a little bit more favorable to Johnny, and in a way that's not exactly honest. Now, sometimes these inconsistencies can look like they are big deals, but sometimes they also will look like they don't really matter all that much in terms of the witness's level of honesty. For example, Mr. Bett testified that he remembered getting to the Eastern Columbia building on May 21st, 2016, somewhere between 7:15 and 7:45, maybe closer to 8 o'clock. Then on cross-examination, Mr. Rottenborn showed Mr. Betts some of the security footage that we've seen previously in this trial, and it showed Mr. Betts, Johnny, and Jerry Judge, the other security guard, going up and down the elevators that night. The footage showed that they arrived around 7 o'clock p.m. and left probably around 8:30 p.m. Now, also on cross-examination, it came up that with regard to leaving that night, Mr. Betts said that he could not remember if Johnny knocked anything over off of any tables in any penthouse that evening. Although this isn't any kind of an admission, obviously, it also doesn't help to discredit whether or not Johnny trashed the penthouse like Amber alleges on his way out. And finally, there was one more instance where there was a sort of an inconsistency in his testimony. Specifically, on cross-examination, he agreed with Mr. Rottenborn that when he, Johnny, and Jerry Judge left Penthouse 3 for Penthouse 5, they ran into Josh Drew, Rocky Pennington, and one other unnamed female. But this is a little bit more of a snag for his testimony because yesterday, Mr. Bett testified that when he and Jerry Judge went into Penthouse 3 in response to Amber's screaming, they found Amber with her friend Rocky along with Johnny. But now he was agreeing with Rottenborn that when he, Johnny, and Jerry Judge then left Penthouse 3 for Penthouse 5, Rocky was over in Penthouse 5 instead. Note that this confusion is something that can totally happen when someone gets lulled into an effective cross-examination. If the witness falls too far into the lawyer's rhythm of questions, sometimes they can end up answering in a way that they don't particularly intend. I personally don't think that this is a particularly terrible detail, though, partly because Ms. Vasquez, on her redirect examination of Mr. Bett, was able to rehabilitate this information. Specifically, she asked Mr. Bett questions to allow him to clarify where he saw Rocky that night, whether Penthouse 3 or Penthouse 5, which in the end was consistent with his original testimony. Then Ms. Vasquez closed off her redirect by asking whether Mr. Bett thought that Johnny appeared intoxicated on April 26, 2016, or on May 21st, 2016. Two instances alleged by Amber. And Mr. Bett responded, no. Okay, so that was Mr. Bett. Did you see his testimony? If you did, let us know what you thought in the comments down below. Otherwise, now let's turn to Keenan Wyatt. So Keenan Wyatt testified that he has been a sound technician on feature films for over 30 years. He's worked on a ton of big movies, including all the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, Alice in Wonderland, Rum Diary, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Lone Ranger, and more. He said that he's not employed by Johnny, although for a while he did work for Johnny's production company, Infinitive Nile. Now, most of Mr. Wyatt's testimony seemed to be to counter Amber's argument that the reason Johnny isn't getting any more work in Hollywood these days isn't because of the op-ed that she wrote, but rather because he already had a bad working reputation. And so Mr. Wyatt was brought in by Johnny Depp's legal team to prove the opposite. Specifically, Mr. Wyatt talked about how Johnny was great to work with on films, he made it easy to work with, and collaborated well with directors. He mentioned how while on set for Pirates of the Caribbean 5, Sean Bailey, one of the executives for Disney, came on set to talk to Johnny about future collaborations in a very friendly conversation. He admitted that sometimes Johnny was late to set, but delivered that information in a way that seemed like it really wasn't an issue. Even later, when he was cross-examined by the opposing side, it was asked whether he agreed that he had sometimes been late for up to 6 hours, and his response seemed more or less the same. Now, one other unique kind of random piece of information that came out here was that Mr. Wyatt also testified that sometimes Johnny would act with an earpiece in his ear. He said that this was often to listen to music while acting, and sometimes it was so that he could be given lines while acting, due to the fact that sometimes Johnny would rewrite lines of dialogue on set. Now, I'm not really sure yet where that piece of information fits into this case, but it was a really fun thing to learn about. Now, Mr. Wyatt was also asked about Johnny's sense of humor, and he said that Johnny had at times a very dark sense of humor, and with a British twist. He said that he was a fan of Monty Python and The Fast Show. Then Mr. Wyatt testified that when Johnny was with his longtime girlfriend before Amber Heard, Vanessa Paradis, And Mr. Wyatt joined them on some of their family vacations. He said he never saw Johnny yell at Vanessa or the kids. He also said that sometimes he and Johnny would drink alcohol together, and that Johnny's behavior didn't really change when he drank, other than maybe to get a little sleepy. And then when Johnny and Amber started their relationship, Mr. Wyatt said that he saw Johnny less, but on occasion was around them. He said that he also never saw Johnny yell at Amber and never saw Johnny abuse anyone ever. He also testified to one incident on a plane from Boston to Los Angeles where he tried to talk to Amber, and Amber said something to the effect of, "How dare you talk to me?" So he said he went back to his seat on the plane and minded his own business. And although he said that Johnny was drinking alcohol on the plane, he said that Johnny did not appear intoxicated and he did not see Johnny be violent towards anyone on the plane. So then we had the cross-examination of Mr. Wyatt by Elaine Bredehoft. And here she really tried to hammer out his biases. At first, she started out relatively strong, pointing out that although Mr. Wyatt may not be on Johnny's payroll, Johnny did ensure that Mr. Wyatt was written into all of Johnny's work contracts so that when Johnny worked, Mr. Wyatt worked. This would tie Mr. Wyatt's financial interests to Johnny's interests, but truth be told, Ms. Bredehoft's questions weren't that clean, and the wheels of her cross-examination started to fall off fairly early on. As an example, she asked Mr. Wyatt details about what was in Johnny's contracts when Mr. Wyatt was not a party to those contracts. He probably rightly said that he didn't know what was in those contracts because he never saw them. However, if she had asked generally about the agreement without the specifics of the contract, she could have had cleaner answers from him without so much room for him to push back on her. And she almost got clean information out of him on the other benefits that he received working with Johnny, including free airfare, accommodations, and more. However, she tried to go so far as to say that Mr. Wyatt would get lodging that was comparable to Johnny's, and Mr. Wyatt rejected that, noting that Johnny would stay in a house while Mr. Wyatt would be in a hotel room. And then she also tried to say that Mr. Wyatt received boosted pay because of working with Johnny, but every single time Mr. Wyatt responded that he got the union minimum pay for his job. Next, Ms. Bredehoft also, for some reason, spent some time going into specifics about the types of alcohol that Johnny would drink: whiskey, champagne, and wine, as well as Red Bull. It was unclear why she was asking these questions, especially when the most effective cross-examinations will be laser-focused and relatively quick. Like in her cross-examination of Isaac Baruch, Ms. Bredehoft seemed to be just wasting time with a lot of her questions and fighting with the witness. Also, the parts of the cross-examination that were the most harmful to Johnny were quickly rehabilitated on redirect. Specifically, on redirect, Mr. Wyatt was asked about when he worked on films not with Johnny, and whether he had those expenses paid. He said that the arrangements for those projects would be exactly the same as when he worked with Johnny. He would have covered airfare, hotels, and more, and he said that he would be paid the union minimum pay, just like he was on Johnny Depp's films. Okay, so that is Keenan Wyatt. Did you see his testimony? If you did, let us know what you thought in the comments down below. Otherwise, let's finally turn to the key testimony of the day: Johnny Depp himself. I will say that starting off, he seemed very tense and unfocused. He seemed like he was struggling for words and didn't really know where to start when asked why he was bringing the litigation. Overall, he had a very slow tempo of his speaking, but over time, it started to look like this was maybe more his natural state of speaking. And throughout his testimony, he started to open up and get comfortable as he went on, and you could visibly see him relaxed from a closed-in person to someone who is able to talk much more openly and much more fluidly. One of the biggest things that sticks out from his testimony today was that the lawyer doing his direct examination would ask one question, such as how he met Amber, and he would have a very long, winding way of slowly painting a picture with his words to answer the question, finally arriving at that answer. He always seemed to have a meaning for the meandering narrative path he would take, but it still was a lot of talking by Johnny for not a lot of questions, to the extent that I was actually surprised that he only drew one objection from the other side. What was interesting to me about this is that it felt very much like the attorneys on the Depp legal team see their role as creating an open space for him to tell his story. I've seen this a lot lot with past clients who have brought different types of lawsuits, who, when they come to us, say, hey, I've been wronged here, and I need to know that my story will be represented here because what happened to me is unfair. So, this right here may very well be the core of what Johnny is trying to do here, to get his story out and feel heard by the public uninterrupted. And thinking back on some of the testimony that we've heard so far, this would fit perfectly with what Dr. Anderson was saying about his and Amber's communication styles. While Amber would rapid fire verbally attack, Johnny would end up just not talking because he otherwise couldn't get a word in edgewise anyway. But then when it was just him and Dr. Anderson, she said that he was actually quite expressive. And that may also explain why the Heard legal team really isn't objecting. You see, sometimes the attorneys can take on a sort of persona on behalf of their clients, partly to portray a subtle message about their client. And so far, we've seen the Depp legal team be quite calm, collected, and measured. And on the other hand, we've seen the Heard legal team be quite aggressive. To be honest, the comparison of these two vibes at the same time really only helped Johnny's side more than Amber's, because Johnny wants the jury to think that all of the aggression is coming from Amber and not from Johnny. So this may explain why they didn't want to object to Johnny's testimony, because it could remind the jury of Dr. Anderson's testimony, where she said that Amber would interrupt Johnny to the extent that he just couldn't say anything. Now, another thing that we generally got to see in his testimony was that he was very illustrative and used metaphorical language. And he said that his writing was very much influenced by his love of works by Van Morrison, J.D. Salinger, and Hunter Thompson, among others. As an example, to describe how his mother caused his family to move a lot when he was growing up, he said her feet were on fire. And to describe his fall from grace from Hollywood, he said, I went from Cinderella to Quasimodo. And to describe how he was completely confused by what Amber was doing at one point in their relationship, he said, I was on planet question mark. And this also relates to another thing he said about his personal expression. He said that when he faces pain, the main way for him to deal with it is through humor, particularly with dark humor. He said he grew up with Monty Python, and so that really influenced him in that regard. And all of this about him describing his expression did a few things. First, it kind of explains some of the weirdness or quirkiness, or in some instances, some shock value of his language that we've come across so far, particularly in text messages that have been read. And it's an indicator that maybe we can't read his writing too literally. He also seemed very apologetic that the courtroom had to read some of his texts, explaining that sometimes when explaining to a friend while in pain, you tend to really exaggerate so they can fully understand how you're feeling. Now, the other thing that this helps to do is to personalize him despite the shocking nature of some of these texts. For some people, the shock value might still be too much, but for others, this might provide enough of an explanation that they can accept that he didn't exactly mean what he was saying, but more using a very dark version of humor to work through pain. Now, on to the substantive testimony. Johnny said that he was bringing this lawsuit to clear his name and to stand up for himself and his children. He referenced his children a lot during his direct examination, concerns for their well-being in the public eye, and also specifically with respect to the allegations that came out about him and the prospect of his kids having to face others at school about it. He also said without any equivocation that he has never struck any women in his life. Looking ahead to cross-examination, it will really be interesting how well that statement holds up in the face of pressure from the opposing side. If he's able to hold firm to that statement and without being impeached from any prior examples, then that is a very strong statement in support of his case. Now, he also said that he had been in the industry for over 30 years and he had never had any issues, and that now, as a result of the op-ed in this case and the other allegations that Ms. Heard had brought, he needed to defend himself and shield his children. Then he talked a lot about his upbringing and how his dad was kind and gentle and how his mom was both verbally and physically abusive. He said his mother would use whatever she could to beat them with, either a high-heeled shoe or a telephone or an ashtray that she would chuck at their head. And as a result, he never felt like he was exposed to safety or security growing up. But despite this physical violence, he said that the worst part was probably the emotional or verbal abuse. Physical wounds could heal, but the emotional scars are a bit harder to heal from what it sounds like. Now, he also said that his mother would yell abusively at his father, and he would just stand there and take it without responding. The most he said his father would do in response was to punch a wall. Specifically, he recalled a time when his father shattered his hand because he punched concrete. Now, this was particularly interesting because it felt like a callback to the whiteboard incident that we heard about Nurse Lloyd, when Johnny Depp apparently punched a whiteboard after an argument with Amber. This testimony from Johnny seems to explain Johnny's reasoning for punching the whiteboard as a safe space to display aggression without hurting anyone else, in the same way that he had seen his father do before. Now, then he turned to describe his acting career and how he actually never set out to be an actor in the first place. He said that in reality, he's actually very shy and introverted, and that he felt much more comfortable being one of four in a band rather than an actor out there in the public on his own. But when his friend Nicolas Cage recommended that he try acting, it worked out for him. And as Johnny said, they paid me exorbitant sums of money, much more than I had ever seen before. And although he had been in Hollywood for a long time already, it really wasn't until he starred in the role of Captain Jack Sparrow in Pirates of the Caribbean that he said that his life suddenly changed. He said that now he had no anonymity, and the interest of people into his life grew astronomically to the extent that he needed to hire more security to keep himself and his family safe. To me, he came across as really humble, saying that he couldn't complain about fame, that he had no right to do so, but that it meant that he had to think creatively about a lot of things. Going to the park with his kids, for example, became a strategic mission. And over time, he simply preferred not to go out because of the media circus that would undoubtedly follow. When talking about fame, he said that it's an odd thing to deal with, that you never really get used to, and it turns into something else altogether. And really, my impression here was that just like Isaac Baruch, who said that he was just a schnook painter living some crazy life, Johnny here made probably the most unrelatable living circumstance on the planet seem incredibly relatable. Next, he talked openly about his drug use. He said that the first time he used drugs was when he was 11 years old. His mom had asked him to bring her one of his nerve pills to relax her, and after he gave one to her, he took one for himself. And to explain why he started doing drugs at age 11, he said it was to escape feeling too much and to escape the chaotic nature of what it was that they were living through. He said, "I've taken the substances over the years to numb the ghosts, the wraiths that were still with me from youth." Essentially, he was self-medicating to mask the pain he felt from years of being abused. He said that although he had periods of sobriety, he did become addicted to roxycodone, an opiate. He also referenced the opioid epidemic in the United States, which was a point of relation that many people probably can have to this experience. And finally, before the end of the day, he talked a little bit about his relationship with Amber. He said that in the beginning, she was wonderful. She seemed to be a perfect partner in a sense because she seemed to be very knowledgeable about old obscure blues music that he really liked. She seemed very well read and funny and kind. And for a year or a year and a half, that's the way that things were until, as Johnny said, things started to reveal themselves. One of those things he described was her desire to control his bedtime. If she wanted to go to bed, but he wanted to stay up, it would not be acceptable to her for him to stay up without her. He also described how early on she had this pattern when he would come home. She would sit him down, take off his boots, and hand him a glass of wine. He said he wasn't really used to this, but she would do it every time he came home. Then one day, when she was busy on the phone, he took off his boots by himself. And as a result, she got upset, saying, "What are you doing? That's my job. You don't do that." And she got him a glass of wine. As he described it, he said that she was upset that he broke her routine. Although on the one hand, this could look like she was just upset that her preferred love language was being stifled, and maybe Amber will testify to exactly that, This could look also, on the other hand, like control and manipulation by Amber. So, anyway, that was around the time that the judge released the jury for recess until the next day, saying that Johnny could continue his testimony tomorrow. On the whole, I think that Johnny came across as sincere, authentic, and real, and a very sympathetic witness. But of course, everyone in the courtroom, including the jury, knows that he's a professional actor who has been in the business for over 30 years. So that is a detail that the jury is going to have to take into consideration when they are evaluating his testimony. But did you see his testimony? If so, what did you think? Let us know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you found this interesting or at least informative. And if you did, I'd love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is uploaded. And you can see tomorrow's live trial testimony right here on this channel with more of Johnny Depp. See you in the next video.